Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Digital Grocer, Season 5, Episode 6. I'm your host, Sylvain Perrier, President and CEO of Mercatus Technologies. And joining me today is Mark Fairhurst, my co-host, Mercatus' VP of Marketing.
Morning, everyone. Morning, Sylvain. Good to see you again.
It's great to see you. It's like, this is kind of like our regular thing now. We're catching up. We're doing much of episodes. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, and someone on my team is very happy that we're doing more shows, as I'm sure some of our retail clients as well.
Absolutely. So this is going to be an interesting show, folks. It's part 3 of a 3-part series. In part 1 and part 2, we interviewed some amazing guests, Zac Wilson from Raley's, director of eCommerce, and John Lucot, the retired president and COO of Giant Eagle. We tackled some important subjects. We talked about the transition out of COVID-19, and I like to think we're in a period of new normal until we hit the fall, I think. The impact of inflation on e-commerce and how retailers are or should prepare and what they're doing to, in fact, prepare. Now, in this episode specifically, we really want to talk about the Canadian and U.S. economy and the impact that it is having on consumers, the risk of a recession, stagflation period. And let's be honest, we also want to tackle, what's happening from a geopolitical perspective and what it is going to do on the economy, the effect on the economy, as well as consumers. Now, as always, it's one thing for Mark and I to really speculate on these broad topics, and in line with our promise to our listeners and core to our own DNA, we decided to bring in an expert to help us tackle this subject. And so joining us today is Claire Fan. Claire joined the Royal Bank of Canada, one of Canada's largest banks, as the economics team in 2019. As an economist, she holds a bachelor's of business administration from the University of Toronto and as a master's of financial economics from Western University. Claire, thank you so much for joining us today on Digital Grocer.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Sylvain.
Awesome. So let's just dive in. We have a bunch of questions we want to ask you. And this is something, Mark and I read all the trades, and we read newspapers in Europe, we read the newspapers in both Canada and U.S. So we like to say we wax philosophically on some of these things, but you're our resident expert for this show today. So we're going to ask you a bunch of questions. Now, to start off, can you share with the audience what you and the team at RBC are seeing as current macro trends for both the U.S. and Canadian economy?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of the current macro trends, let's start with the current macro state of both the Canadian and U.S. economy. So where we're at is really a really sort of healthy, strong economic conditions that's deemed to be actually in excess demand by both central banks. So pretty much over the course of the pandemic, demand for goods, particularly durable goods, from consumers has become extremely elevated. And part of that was because a lot of the close contact services, things like travel or dining out simply weren't available for consumers to purchase. So they opted, buy more goods instead. It was toilet papers at the very beginning, and it morphed into PCs, tablets throughout the pandemic. So that's been happening for quite a while now. And now what we're seeing with these close contact services reopening, everyone's heading to the airport, everyone's going somewhere, and travel demand is picking up. Travel services, is rebounding quite rapidly as well. So we're really sort of at this top of the hill sort of economic condition where consumer demand is extremely resilient and strong. And at the same time, we've been having a lot of problems on the supply side. So we've all heard about supply chain disruptions, the extended shipping time, elevated shipping expenses. On top of that, the chip shortage, the geopolitical sort of turmoil that we will be touching on later as well. So a lot of that is creating disruptions for, wholesalers, manufacturers, importers, and retailers to be able to produce enough to catch up with the demand that we spoke about that was so elevated. So in this sort of scenario, it's not really adding to growth anymore. We're not seeing growth increasing drastically any further. What we're seeing is higher prices.
Mhm.
And that makes a lot of sense, in this sort of scenario. So inflation has been surging globally, here in Canada, in the United States as well. At the same time, labor market conditions are extremely sort of elevated. We counted about 70% higher in job openings relative to pre-pandemic, competing for 13% fewer unemployed workers. So it's a really unbalanced sort of dynamic, even in the labor market, that's been driving wage growth higher. So it's that's sort of where we're at this stage, really.
That's just an eye opener. And is you and your team at RBC, are you guys seeing a change how consumers are spending or saving their money right now?
Well, yeah. Well, the short answer to that question so far is no, but we do expect to see some changes upcoming. First of all, in the near term, what we counted the savings stockpile that's hoarded by consumers, partially because, again, they weren't able to consume, partially because a lot of them were receiving government support throughout the pandemic. So that counted to be north of $300 billion, and that's a huge amount. That's roughly equal to 3 times the annual total spend on travel activities back in 2019. So that's going to offer some buffer in the near term, with higher inflation biting more into consumers' purchasing power, as well as, rising interest rate pushing debt servicing more, debt servicing costs higher. So all of these headwinds to consumer spending will be countered a little bit, at least in the near term, just because of this buffering that we spoke about. But and we're seeing exactly that. So we do track internally, our own debit and credit card spending, and that's showing something like total spending still 30% above levels pre-pandemic, and
Oh,
that's
wow.
Interesting.
2019.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's extremely elevated, and part of that will be price increases. But if we see inflation is it's not only, but it's only 11%. So 11% of that 30% would be price increase, but all the rest of that 30% would be organic, strong, incredibly strong spending at the moment still. So that's where we're at right now. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love the fact that you kind of talk about this buffer. Mark and I recently had a conversation with a grocery retail CEO out of the United States, where we were asking questions about what are you doing in your business in terms of protecting price increases down to your consumers, and he was sharing very much their strategic process. We push back on the consumer packaged goods companies to defer price increases so we can control, and they have done that quite easily in the first 6 months of the year. The latter part of the year will be very difficult. They will have to allow it to go through, and also they are going back out to market to source for different providers,
Mm.
and that becomes very difficult because, as you're saying, the supply lines are still constrained to a certain extent. Now, I I'm old enough to remember, and maybe not that old enough to remember, but when we went through in Canada in '82 a stagflation period, and at the time our Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, had put a price freeze on, I think it was dairy and wheat products and so on. So could and recently we just went through a 1% rate hike here in Canada. The U.S. has gone through an increase in interest rates as well, and the media is talking about recession, stagflation. And my experience, seeing my parents go through it, and this is a two-part question for you. Can you define stagflation for us? And if you can, I'd love to. And maybe it's a three-part question now. Draw a comparison of the stagflation we may be in today, if we are, versus what we lived through in '82.
Sure. So to define stagflation to begin with, which is the first part of the three-part question, so stagflation would be a period where you see slowing in economic activities, labor market conditions start to deteriorate, but at the same time you see inflation accelerates. So all three of those are just sort of what makes a stagflation type of scenario in the economy, and we're simply not in that sort of scenario. As I spoke about earlier in the first question, the current inflation trends are very much driven by really strong economic fundamentals still. So we're at an incredibly, sort of heated condition, and that's what's been driving the inflation trends these days. And there are a lot of reasons to expect inflation to start to come down. And we counted, it should turn a corner by the end of next quarter, although we
Mhm.
have been saying that for quite a while. um, but yeah, eventually it will be true. But a lot of headwinds for inflation. We're seeing persistent easing in an assortment of shipping indicators. We do get shipping time, Flexport data that counts the days, products, from factory floor in Asia that it gets to here in North America as well as Northern Europe. So that time has been shortening quite significantly, and that's not something that's seasonal because it's persistent for quite a while. It's been persisting for quite a while now. So we're seeing a lot of that at the same time, global commodity prices. So wheat prices and oil prices. I don't know where oil prices. It's a tough one. It's the volatility in the oil price markets is just quite substantial these days. But still, they've come down from 120 bucks per barrel a month ago to something, if I counted correctly, it was more like 96 yesterday when the
Mhm.
markets closed. So, with a lot of those sort of turning a quarter, we do expect to see some good signs in terms of inflation slowing, presumably coming very soon, both in Canada and the U.S., especially with, the central bank hiking rates more substantially as well. So what we're seeing of the three-part that's required for a stagflation to happen, we're expecting inflation to come down. So that's why we're not expecting both economies to be heading for a stagflation. But at the same time, the risk of a recession is actually rising at this as we speak, and that's simply because it's the Bank of Canada, like you said, has hiked rates by a surprise, a bigger 1 full percentage point just earlier this week, and it's sort of absolutely necessary at this point for them to keep inflation expectations well anchored, because once they lose that, it will take much drastic and higher rate hikes in order to bring those expectations down to 2% again. And like all of us, we don't really expect the bank to be willing to risk sort of having that happen. So,
Mhm.
with the central banks dialing rates steadily up, or not steadily, sorry, actually in a quite drastic pace over the near term, above the neutral range to more of a restrictive territory. So, and that's going to put a strain on economic activity down in 2023. So we do expect a small, mild, or relatively short-lived recession. That's in our base case now, and we think is quite likely. And from there on, if both things that we're expecting were to be true, meaning that inflation's coming down more steadily, and at the same time we do get a small decline or contraction in economic conditions, then at that time, we think the bank will reassess and start to reverse course and bring rates lower.
Now, I can remember I was in Los Angeles when the Soviets decided to invade Ukraine. And the one thing that, and I consider myself a student of history. So I'm pulling out, books, right? The history of Russia, the history of Ukraine, and come to find out that those countries are, have been historically intertwined, and the Ukraine is considered the breadbasket of that whole region. And now we're hearing concerns of being able to export wheat. We're seeing natural gas being cut into Europe. How much of this geopolitical conflict is going to have an impact on consumers come Q3, Q4 of this year?
That's a great question. We've done quite a lot of analysis at the beginning of this whole geopolitical when it just started to unfold back in spring. And the first of all, to count the direct trade linkages from Canada to Russia and Ukraine is quite small. So we don't have a lot of direct trades with them. We don't export a lot to them. We don't import a lot from them. So from that perspective, it's not sort of any sort of material impact in terms of what we're trading. It's more so everything's flowing through from prices. So we're back to inflation again. So sort of like he said, Ukraine itself, actually, I think, well, it's definitely already having quite a big impact in terms of supporting wheat and other commodities to areas close to Russia and Ukraine. But Ukraine, we counted to be exporting something like 3% of global wheat consumption. And we think Russia is still exporting at the moment, although there are a lot of sanctions obviously going on. But, back to the point, direct trade, not so much of an impact, but it is, markets are pricing in what could be happening down the future. And that's sort of what's been driving, the surge in wheat prices at the beginning. Markets were foreseeing a lot of future disruptions that could potentially cause an impact to global supply. So that's what's been driving commodity prices much higher, and that's what's been driving, unfortunately, local gasoline prices also much higher. I haven't checked lately. I don't want to check. Like every time I pass by a gas station, it's a few cents higher. So. But to that point, it's really sort of an inflation where we expect the geopolitical sort of influence to flow through. And on that front, commodity prices have turned a corner. Exactly how this geopolitical sort of situation unfolds in the future is something that's, it's quite an uncertainty at the moment. But we believe that, prices after having hit a peak already, the further sort of impact on inflation trends is probably downward.
On that note, I mean, interestingly enough, I believe Canadian wheat farmers are expected to have a bumper crop this year, and they've actually planted more crop, and that which will hopefully offset some of the food price increases.
Yeah,
that's great. And so to the business leaders that are listening to the podcast and they're starting to plan for 2023, any advice for them?
Yes, of course. So first of all, there's three things I would say to sort of expect for from anyone really in terms of what we're projecting in our base case. First of all, we can expect lower inflation, and we counted all the headwinds and why we can reasonably, from this point on, hopefully expect lower inflation trends absent any sort of major disruptions to or any sort of other geopolitical, drivers happening. Again, I'm losing my words, but you get the idea. So lower inflation in our base case, we are expecting core inflation. So core inflation is defined as anything outside of food and gasoline. So, and it's more a true reflection of domestic consumer demand rather than a lot of these global factors, because food prices will be influenced by wheat. Gas prices will be influenced by oil prices. But so core inflation is expected to dial lower to 3% by the end of this year. So, it's that's what we're projecting, and moving into 2024, it's going to hopefully start to come closer to the target range of 1 to 3%. And the second thing that we can all expect is obviously slower domestic and foreign demand for goods and services. And, in the near term, we talked about the savings, buffering a lot of the headwinds. But in the longer run, first of all, the savings is not evenly distributed around among households. Higher income households have saved more of the excess savings in comparison to some of those that are earning lower income. So that means a substantially smaller buffer for these households that are historically also more sensitive to economic cycles. So these are the households that are going to have to pull back demand first. They'll have to rethink about their spending pattern and reallocate their budget, curb back on things that are discretionary, just because, things like food and gas, they're non-discretionary and the costs are surging so much higher. So it's going to cut into their spending first, and it's going to spread more to a broader lessening demand from consumers across goods and services, eventually, lead to a mild downturn in 2023. So that's the second thing to expect. And the third thing to expect, the labor shortage issue, which I'm sure like a lot of business leaders are struggling with. When we have demand lessening over 2023, we might see a temporary easing in the sort, just because there simply aren't the same level of demand for workers, probably with consumer demand for consumption lowering. But you can expect that to come back, because we've been talking about this for a while now. It's labor shortages. They're underpinned by long run structural demographic changes. They're the new normal. We already have a substantial proportion of the working age population above the age of 65, and that's only going to grow. In Canada, we have great immigration policy, which is going to offset some of that, but it's not going to offset the sort of broader trend of aging demographics. So expect that to come back. So and at the same time, a lot of things can be done. Invest better for better equipment, invest in retaining or training program to get more out of the existing pool of labor that you already have. We think would be sort of the solution moving forward. So that's pretty much what we're expecting for the economy into 2023. And yeah.
Awesome. So I think the one to kind of synthesize also what Claire just shared with us is, for the retailers that are considered EDLP, everyday low price, right? We can think of some of the ones here in Canada. You would have Walmart, you would have No Frills in the United States, and then there are a ton of those. This is a great time if you have a consumer that is going to be tight on capital, you risk of them trading out of your business and going to your competitor that can offer an even better price. Normally, we would advise at this point to make strong investments in your private label brands that are typically less expensive than your national brands, but offer you better margin as a retailer. So at the very least, you're protecting your AOV, although your unit accounts per order will go down. And also, we're seeing the U.S. government, and I think, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, the U.S. government just announced a revised investment in SNAP EBT.
USDA is expanding the program.
USDA is expanding their program to be able to help consumers. So great advice, Claire. It's been amazing having you on our show. Thank you so much. Thank you for lending credibility to a subject that most people just read the headlines, right? And they just, you kind of demystified it for us. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Claire.
It's been a pleasure.
Folks, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. We got our next episode will be really amazing. We're going to be bringing on board Mike Davidson. He is the CEO of Buehler's from Wooster, Ohio. Mike's going to kind of share from his perspective what's happening at Buehler's and how they're preparing for the current economical situation and how they're servicing their customers.
Thanks for watching and listening to our show. We've got more great episodes on digitalgrocer.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media at Digital Grocer on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and at digital_grocer on Twitter. Like, subscribe, and click that bell icon so you never miss another Digital Grocer podcast.